The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Marcus Chen barely noticed as he hunched over the array of monitors that dominated his cramped apartment. Outside, the neon glow of Neo Francisco painted the fog in electric blues and purples, but inside his sanctum of circuits and screens, time moved differently. Here, in this maze of salvaged quantum processors and jury-rigged signal amplifiers, Marcus existed in a world where hope still flickered like dying stars in the vast emptiness of space. For 3 years, he had been listening. 3 years since the Convergence War ended and humanity crawled from the ashes to find themselves alone in a universe that had suddenly become very small. The alien coalition that had nearly wiped them out had vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving behind only scorched worlds and the bitter taste of defeat. Earth's survivors told themselves they were lucky to be alive, but Marcus knew better. They were insects that had been ignored after their nest was kicked, nothing more. The official story was that humanity had fought valiantly and forced the aliens to retreat. The truth was darker. They had simply been deemed unworthy of complete extermination. The aliens had taken what they wanted and left, and now Earth's governments maintained the fiction of victory while secretly preparing for the inevitable return. Marcus had been a communications specialist during the war, one of the few who understood the quantum-encrypted alien transmissions well enough to partially decode them. When the government disbanded his unit and classified everything they'd learned, he'd stolen what he could and disappeared into the underground. If the aliens were coming back, he wanted to be ready. More than that, he wanted to be the one to make first contact on humanity's terms. The signal that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday at 3:47 a.m. It wasn't like the harsh, mechanical transmissions from the war. This one sang, literally. Beneath the quantum static and the impossible mathematics of faster-than-light communication, there was something that could only be described as music. Complex harmonics that made his modified equipment hum in sympathy, as if the machines themselves were trying to respond. Marcus's fingers flew over his keyboards, routing the signal through every filter and analyzer he'd built. The pattern was consistent with the alien communication protocols he'd studied, but the content was entirely different. Where military transmissions had been cold and efficient, this felt personal. "What are you?" he whispered to the scrolling data streams. Over the following weeks, the signals came regularly, always at the same time, always carrying that haunting musical quality. Marcus began to recognize patterns, not just in the carrier wave, but in something deeper. Emotional resonance. Pain. Loneliness. A reaching out across the void that felt achingly familiar. He stopped eating regularly. Stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. His sparse savings dwindled as he ordered more sensitive equipment, pushing his setup beyond legal limits. The neighbors complained about the electronic interference, but Marcus had moved beyond caring about such mundane concerns. He was close to something extraordinary. The breakthrough came when he realized the signals weren't random communications at all, they were responses. Every time he'd adjusted his equipment, made modifications to his transmission array, the signals had shifted in reply. For weeks, he'd been having a conversation without knowing it. That night, Marcus sat in his chair and did something that would have earned him a firing squad during the war. He transmitted directly back. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every screen in his apartment blazed with light as data flooded his systems faster than they could process it. But, beneath the cascade of information, he could feel something else: surprise, joy, and a desperate hope that mirrored his own. When the data storm finally subsided, Marcus found himself staring at a single image on his main monitor. It was clearly alien in origin, the mathematical constants were wrong, the color spectrum shifted, but the subject was unmistakable. It was a face, feminine in its proportions despite the silvery skin and large, luminous eyes that seemed to look directly at him through the screen. Below the image, in halting but recognizable English, were 3 words: "Please. Help. Trapped." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. This wasn't a military transmission or a random signal from space. This was a distress call from someone who had been alone in the dark for far too long, someone who had learned his language just to reach out to him. "Who are you?" he typed back, his fingers trembling as he prepared the transmission. The reply came with another image, what looked like the interior of a ship, but wrong somehow. The corridors seemed to pulse with organic life, and the walls were covered in a crystalline substance that resembled both technology and living tissue. In the center of the image was a pod or chamber, clearly designed to hold a humanoid form. "Zara," came the text response. "Ship damaged. Cannot leave. Cannot die. So alone." Marcus stared at the message, processing its implications. During the war, they'd learned that the alien coalition wasn't a single species but dozens of them, united by technology and purpose. Some were more humanoid than others, but they'd all shared certain characteristics, advanced beyond human understanding, cold in their efficiency, utterly alien in their thinking. This Zara was different. The pain in her message was raw and human in its intensity, even if she wasn't human herself. She was trapped in what remained of her ship, kept alive by systems she couldn't fully control, calling out into the void for any response. "Where are you?" Marcus transmitted. The reply came with coordinates, not for deep space, as he'd expected, but for a location in Earth's own solar system. The asteroid belt, hidden among the countless chunks of rock and ice that orbited between Mars and Jupiter. She'd been there for years, possibly since the end of the war, slowly dying in a ship that refused to let her die. Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He began planning a rescue mission. The next 3 months passed in a blur of frantic activity. Marcus liquidated everything he owned, called in every favor from his days in the military, and assembled a plan that was equal parts brilliant and insane. He would steal a deep space mining vessel, modify it for the journey, and somehow reach Zara before her ship's failing systems finally gave out. Every night, they talked. Through quantum transmissions that cost him a fortune in power and equipment, Marcus learned about Zara's people, the Kithara, a species of explorers and artists who had joined the coalition not for conquest but for protection from something even more terrible that stalked the galaxy's outer rim. She had been a scout, sent to map human communication networks, when her ship had been damaged in the final battles of the war. The organic technology that kept her alive was as much curse as blessing. It had sealed her in a life support pod when the ship was critically damaged, but the trauma of the impact had corrupted its programming. It wouldn't let her die, but it also wouldn't let her leave. She existed in a state of suspended animation punctuated by brief periods of wakefulness, during which she could operate her ship's communication array. "Why didn't you call for help from your own people?" Marcus asked during one of their late-night conversations. "Coalition is gone," Zara replied. "Scattered. The Devourers came too soon. My people. I don't know if my people still exist. The Devourers." Marcus had heard whispers of them during the war, fragments of intercepted communications that spoke of something so terrible that it had driven dozens of advanced species to unite against humanity, not out of hatred, but out of desperate need for any ally they could find. Humanity had been intended as cannon fodder, a primitive species to throw at an enemy that consumed worlds. "You're not alone," Marcus transmitted. "I'm coming for you." There was a long pause before her reply arrived. "Why? Your species and mine were enemies. I was sent to help destroy you." Marcus thought about that for a long time before answering. "Because being enemies doesn't mean we have to be enemies forever. And because no one should die alone in the dark." The mining ship Phoenix was a testament to human engineering at its most pragmatic. Built for long-haul operations in the asteroid belt, it was essentially a massive engine strapped to a cargo hold, with just enough life support to keep a small crew alive for months at a time. Marcus had chosen it not for its elegance but for its capability, and because its corporate owners had written it off as a loss after a navigational computer failure had left it stranded in a slowly decaying orbit around Ceres. Getting to the ship was the easy part. Marcus had maintained contacts in the salvage industry, and a hefty bribe to the right people had gotten him aboard with no questions asked. The hard part was the modifications he needed to make in the 3 days before someone noticed the ship was drawing power again. Working 18-hour days in the cramped maintenance tunnels, Marcus rewired the navigation systems to accept quantum encrypted coordinates, upgraded the communication array with components stolen from his apartment, and rigged the ship's mining lasers for a purpose their designers had never intended. If Zara's ship was as damaged as she claimed, he might need to cut her out of it. On the fourth day, as Earth fell away behind him and the asteroid belt rose to meet his approach, Marcus finally allowed himself to believe that his plan might actually work. The Phoenix responded to his commands with the stolid reliability of good industrial design, and his modifications were holding up under the stress of deep space operation. "Phoenix to Zara," he transmitted as he approached her coordinates. "I'm here." The reply came immediately, flooded with emotional overtones that his equipment could barely interpret. "Marcus, I can see you. Your ship, it's so small. How are you here?" "Long story," Marcus said, adjusting his trajectory to match the tumbling asteroid that hit her ship. "Just hang on. I'm coming to get you out of there." What he found when he finally located her ship made him question everything he thought he understood about alien technology. The vessel was embedded in the asteroid like a tumor, its organic hull fused with the rock in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, flowing lines that suggested both advanced engineering and living growth, surfaces that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns despite the obvious damage. "The ship is alive," Zara explained as Marcus maneuvered the Phoenix closer. "Not intelligent, but alive. It has been trying to heal itself, but the damage was too severe. It cannot distinguish between the asteroid and enemy fire. It thinks the rock is part of me now." Marcus studied the fused mass through his ship's cameras, looking for any way to separate the organic vessel from its rocky prison. The ship's hull was covered in what looked like crystalline growths, the same substance he'd seen in Zara's earlier images, but here it was spreading outward, trying to incorporate the asteroid's mineral structure into itself. "I'm going to have to cut you out," he said finally. "Can you get to an airlock?" "No. The ship will not let me leave my pod." "But, Marcus." There was a pause, and, when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of significance he couldn't quite understand. "The pod is not just life support. It is, how do you say, symbiotic. Part of me now. If you separate it from the ship, you must be prepared. I am not what I was before. I don't understand. The ship's biological systems have been keeping me alive for years. They have adapted me. Changed me to be more compatible with their function. I am still Kythera, but I am also something new. Something that might frighten you." Marcus thought about that as he positioned the Phoenix's mining laser array. He'd come here to rescue someone who had reached out to him across the void, someone who had shared their loneliness and pain with a stranger from an enemy species. Whatever changes the ship had made to her, the person who had called for help was still in there. "I'm not easily frightened," he transmitted. "Just tell me how to get you out of there." The process took 6 hours of delicate work with tools designed to carve up asteroids, not perform surgery on living ships. Marcus had to cut through layers of fused rock and crystalline growth, following Zara's guidance as she directed him toward the pod that had become her prison and sanctuary. When he finally broke through the ship's inner hull, what emerged made him step back from his control console in shock. The pod was beautiful in an alien way, its surface covered in the same crystalline patterns as the ship's hull but arranged in spiraling designs that seemed to shift and flow as he watched. And, inside, visible through a transparent section that might have been glass or might have been living tissue, was Zara herself. She was recognizably the being from the images she'd sent, but changed. Her silvery skin now carried veins of the same crystalline material that covered her ship, patterns that pulsed with soft bioluminescence. Her hair, if it could be called hair, moved like liquid mercury, and her large eyes held depths that suggested intelligence far beyond what he'd expected. But it was the way she moved that told him everything he needed to know. As the pod drifted free of her ship, she pressed her hand against the transparent barrier and looked directly at his cameras. In that gesture, he saw not an alien monster or an advanced being beyond his comprehension, but someone who had been alone in the dark for far too long and was finally, impossibly, no longer alone. "Hello, Marcus," she transmitted, and, for the first time since their conversations had begun, he could hear emotion in her voice that wasn't filtered through quantum static. "Thank you for coming for me." Marcus initiated the docking procedure to bring her pod aboard the Phoenix, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. He was about to become the first human to willingly bring an alien aboard their ship since the end of the war, and not just any alien, one who had been sent to help destroy his species. But, as the docking clamps engaged and he felt the pod settle into the Phoenix's cargo bay, Marcus realized that the distinction between human and alien had become meaningless somewhere in the darkness between stars. What mattered was that someone had called for help, and someone had answered. The real journey was just beginning. Part 2, the symbiosis of understanding. The process of opening Zara's pod took 3 days, not because of any technical difficulty, but because Marcus needed that time to prepare himself for what he was about to do. The life support systems that had kept her alive were unlike anything in human experience, part technology, part biology, all alien in their fundamental assumptions about what life required to sustain itself. Through the pod's communication interface, Zara guided him through the awakening process. It was less like operating a machine and more like coaxing a living thing to release its hold on something precious. The crystalline growth patterns on the pod's surface shifted and flowed as Marcus followed her instructions, adjusting atmospheric composition and gradually reducing the pod's life support functions. The ship's biology became part of me to keep me alive, Zara explained during one of their conversations as the process continued. But it was designed for deep space exploration, not for long-term habitation. It has been improvising. I do not know what I will be like outside the pod. Marcus had spent the waiting time preparing the Phoenix's medical bay with everything he could improvise for dealing with an unknown alien physiology. He'd rigged atmospheric controls that could provide everything from pure oxygen to the nitrogen-rich mixture that Zara's people preferred, and he'd studied every scrap of data from the war about Kitharan biology. What he learned was both reassuring and concerning. The Kithara were remarkably adaptable, which had made them excellent explorers but also meant their biology was prone to symbiotic relationships with other organisms. The ship's life support systems hadn't just kept Zara alive, they'd been slowly rewriting her genetic structure to be more compatible with their function. The changes are permanent, she'd told him during one of their late-night conversations. I am no longer entirely Kithara. The ship's systems have made me into something new. I do not know if my own people would recognize me now. When the pod finally opened with a soft hiss of equalizing atmosphere, what emerged was both exactly what Marcus had expected and nothing like he'd prepared for. Zara was humanoid in her basic proportions, 2 arms, 2 legs, a recognizable torso and head, but the crystalline patterns that covered her skin were clearly functional, not decorative. They pulsed with soft light as she breathed, and he could see them processing the Phoenix's atmosphere in real time. She was taller than he'd expected, nearly 6.5 feet, with the elongated limbs common to species that had evolved in low-gravity environments. Her hair was indeed liquid mercury, flowing around her head in response to magnetic fields and emotional states. But it was her eyes that held his attention, large and luminous, with pupils that dilated and contracted not just in response to light but to some internal rhythm he couldn't understand. "Hello, Marcus," she said, and her voice was exactly as he'd imagined it would be, musical and precise, with just enough accent to remind him that English was not her first language. "It is strange to see you with more than electronic eyes." Marcus found himself speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by the reality of her presence. For months, she'd been a voice in the dark, a pattern of data on his screens. Now she was standing in his ship, breathing his air, looking at him with an expression of curiosity and hope that transcended species boundaries. "You're beautiful," he said without thinking, then immediately felt foolish for the inadequacy of the words. Zara tilted her head, a gesture that was both alien and endearingly familiar. "Beautiful is not a word I would use. The ship's changes have made me into something that exists between worlds. But you are exactly as I imagined. Small for your species, but with kind eyes. This is what drew me to your transmissions, not just your technical skill, but the kindness in how you spoke to the darkness." Over the following days, as they began the long journey back toward Earth's inner solar system, Marcus learned what it meant to share space with someone whose very existence challenged every assumption he'd held about the nature of consciousness and identity. Zara needed very little sleep, but she dreamed constantly, not the random neural firing that characterized human dreams, but structured experiences that she shared with the ship's biological systems even now that she was separated from them. She would stand at the observation port for hours, watching the stars with an intensity that suggested she was seeing things invisible to human perception. My people navigate by quantum resonance, she explained when Marcus asked about her stellar observations. We feel the gravitational relationships between stellar bodies as music. Your ship moves through space like a deaf person trying to dance, functional, but missing the harmony. She was endlessly curious about human culture and psychology, asking questions that ranged from practical to philosophical. Why did humans fear death when their lives were so brief anyway? How could a species that had barely mastered faster-than-light travel produce such complex artistic expressions? What did it mean to be alone in a universe that seemed infinite? Your species confuses me, she admitted one evening as they sat in the Phoenix's small common area, sharing a meal that Marcus had carefully prepared to be compatible with her modified biology. During the war, our strategists believed humans were simply an aggressive species driven by territorial impulses. But your rescue of me suggests something more complex. Marcus thought about that as he watched her eat. Her dietary needs were simpler than he'd expected. She could process almost any organic matter for energy, a modification that the ship's systems had made to keep her alive during the long years of isolation. But she seemed to appreciate the effort he'd put into making the food appealing, even if her taste receptors operated on different principles than his own. Maybe your strategists were looking at our worst qualities, he said finally. Humans at war aren't really representative of what we can be. Most of us just want to live our lives, create things, connect with others. The aggression comes from fear, usually. And yet you came to rescue me, knowing I was sent to help destroy your world. That suggests either great foolishness or great wisdom. Marcus laughed, a sound that made the crystalline patterns on Zara's skin pulse with sympathetic resonance. Probably a little of both. But you reached out to me when you could have stayed silent. You learned my language when you could have simply waited to die. That tells me more about who you really are than anything your military commanders might have ordered you to do. It was during their third week together that Marcus began to understand the true extent of the changes that the ship's systems had made to Zara's biology. She didn't just process information differently than humans, she processed reality itself differently. Her perception existed across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously, allowing her to see quantum probability patterns and gravitational fluctuations as clearly as Marcus could see the stars outside their viewport. Your species experiences time as a river, she explained during one of their evening conversations. Forward motion, with the past behind you and the future ahead. But my perception shows me time as an ocean, currents and depths and patterns that flow in all directions at once. It makes navigation easier, but it makes it hard to exist in any single moment. This explained the distant quality that sometimes came over her, the way she would suddenly stop speaking mid-sentence and stare at nothing for long minutes before returning to the conversation as if no time had passed. She was experiencing temporal echoes, glimpses of possible futures and alternative presents that her enhanced perception couldn't entirely filter out. It also explained why she had been so certain that Marcus would come for her, even when he'd first received her distress call. From her perspective, their meeting hadn't been a possibility but a probability wave that she could observe across multiple timelines. In most futures, you ignore my transmissions, she told him one night as they watched the asteroid belt recede behind them. In some, you report me to your authorities. But, in a small percentage of probability streams, you risk everything to save someone you've never met. I calculated that this was the timeline we were moving toward, but I could not be certain until you actually arrived. The philosophical implications of what she was describing made Marcus's head spin. If Zara could perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, what did that mean for concepts like free will and choice? Had he rescued her because he'd chosen to, or because she'd observed him doing so across the probability matrix? Both, Zara said when he voiced these concerns. Choice creates the probability patterns I observe. I could see that you were someone who would choose to help, given the right circumstances, but I could not force that choice. I could only encourage the circumstances that would make it more likely. Marcus was still processing this revelation when the Phoenix's proximity alarms began blaring. They were still 2 weeks out from Earth, traveling through what should have been empty space, but the sensors were detecting multiple contacts approaching fast. Military vessels, Marcus said, reading the sensor data with growing dread. They're flying Earth Defense Force signatures, but they're moving too fast for anything in our fleet. Zara moved to the sensor console, her crystalline skin pattern shifting to a deeper blue as she processed the information. "These are not your ships," she said quietly. "The quantum signatures are wrong. Someone is using human identification codes, but the vessels themselves are other." The truth became clear when the first ship moved close enough for visual identification. It was sleek and predatory, built along design principles that suggested both advanced technology and a fundamental disregard for the comfort of its occupants. The hull was covered in the same crystalline growth patterns that Marcus had seen on Zara's ship, but arranged in aggressive, angular configurations that spoke of weapons and war. "Kitharan design," Zara whispered, her skin patterns now shifting between blue and deep purple. "But wrong. Corrupted. These are ships of the consumed." "The what?" "My people who accepted symbiosis with the Devourers," she said, her voice heavy with grief and revulsion. "They traded their consciousness for power, becoming extensions of something vast and hungry. I thought they were all destroyed when the Kitharan homeworld fell, but..." The communication system crackled to life, and a voice that was recognizably Kitharan but wrong in every possible way filled the Phoenix's bridge. It spoke in harmonics that hurt to hear, words that seemed to bypass the ears and go directly to the brain with messages of submission and consumption. "Sister of the deep currents," the voice said, addressing Zara directly. "You have hidden in the small spaces for too long. The hunger calls you home." Zara's response was immediate and filled with such vehemence that the Phoenix's hull plates resonated with sympathetic vibrations. She spoke in her own language, but Marcus could feel the meaning even without understanding the words: defiance, revulsion, and absolute rejection. The reply came in the form of weapons fire. The first salvo missed, but barely. Energy beams that seemed to bend space itself around them passed close enough to the Phoenix to overload several sensor arrays. Marcus threw the ship into evasive maneuvers, pushing the industrial vessel beyond its design specifications as more shots filled the space around them. "They want me alive," Zara said, her hands moving over the Phoenix's control systems with an intuitive understanding that shouldn't have been possible. "But they will destroy you to prevent my escape. We cannot outrun them." Marcus was about to ask what options they had when he felt the ship's systems respond to Zara's touch in ways that defied everything he knew about human engineering. The engines began producing harmonic frequencies that shouldn't have been possible with their design, and the navigation systems started plotting courses that took quantum probability into account rather than just Newtonian physics. "What are you doing?" he asked as the Phoenix began moving in ways that seemed to violate basic laws of motion. "The ship's systems are compatible with my enhanced biology," Zara replied, her crystalline patterns now blazing with bright silver light. "I can interface with them directly, optimize their function beyond their original design parameters." "But, Marcus, there is something you must understand. If we are to survive this, I will have to change more than just the ship." Before he could ask what she meant, Zara pressed her hand to the main control console, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift in the Phoenix itself. The ship's systems came alive in a way they'd never been designed for, integrating with each other at a level that transformed the entire vessel into something approaching a living organism. But the changes weren't limited to the ship. As Zara's enhanced biology interfaced with the Phoenix's systems, Marcus felt something reaching out to him, a connection that bypassed his conscious mind and spoke directly to his nervous system. The ship was offering him a choice: remain human and limited, or accept integration and become something more. Outside, the consumed ships were closing in, their weapons charging for what would likely be a final salvo. Marcus had seconds to decide whether to trust an alien who had already been transformed by symbiotic technology beyond anything her own people would recognize. He reached out and took Zara's other hand. The integration was unlike anything he could have imagined. It wasn't painful, exactly, but it was overwhelming, like suddenly being able to see colors that had never existed, or hear music played on instruments made of quantum probability. He could feel the Phoenix's systems as extensions of his own nervous system, understand the mathematical relationships between stellar objects as if they were physical sensations. And he could feel Zara herself, not just her thoughts, but her entire experience of reality. The way she perceived time as an ocean of possibilities, the quantum harmonics that guided her people's navigation, the deep sadness that came with being the last uncorrupted Kythera in known space. Together, they became something that was neither entirely human nor entirely Kytheran, but something new, a synthesis of biological adaptability and technological innovation that allowed them to push the Phoenix beyond any rational limitation. The ship that emerged from their collaboration no longer moved through space so much as it danced with it. They slipped between the consumed vessels like water flowing around stones, their path guided by probability calculations that showed them routes through spacetime that hadn't existed moments before. But, as Earth grew larger in their viewports and the immediate threat receded, Marcus began to understand the true cost of what they'd done. The integration wasn't temporary, it had changed him at a fundamental level, rewriting his genetic structure to be compatible with Kytheran biotechnology. He was still human, but he was also something more, something that would be as alien to his own species as Zara had been to hers. "I'm sorry," Zara said as they entered Earth's solar system, her mental voice carrying overtones of guilt and regret. "I should have warned you more clearly about what the integration would cost. You chose to save me from isolation, but, in doing so, you have accepted isolation yourself." Marcus considered that as he watched Earth approach, the blue-green world that had been his home and might never truly be his home again. The integration had given him capabilities that no human had ever possessed, but it had also marked him as fundamentally different from his own species. He would be studied, feared, possibly imprisoned for what he'd become. But, as he felt Zara's presence intertwined with his own consciousness, her relief at no longer being alone in the universe, he realized that some prices were worth paying. "Maybe isolation isn't about being different from everyone else," he said. "Maybe it's about not having anyone who understands what it's like to be you. And we understand each other now, don't we?" Zara's response came not in words but in a flood of emotion, gratitude, affection, and something deeper that might have been love if such concepts could bridge the gap between species. They were no longer human and Kythera sharing a ship, but two parts of something new, something that had never existed before in the universe. The real test was just ahead.